Thank you very much, Fintan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank Thingmonk for inviting me here to speak. I am not going to talk about technology. I'm going to talk about the politics of the technology, and indeed about the political consequences of some of the stuff that you are doing. Did you know that by 2020, the European data economy is predicted to be worth over 640 billion euros? Many companies, like yourselves, are able to monetize the data trails that we all leave online. And you, of all people, will know very well how data is essential to all kinds of new businesses, including things in healthcare, in energy management, smart cities, the Internet of Things. This is what we mean by data is the new currency. Data has become a valuable commodity that is exchanged and traded and transferred across borders minute by minute. Data is involved in a whole multitude of things, including apps, advertising, and customer services. Companies that trade in data have very high stock market valuations. For example, did you know that Facebook is bigger than Coca-Cola when measured by its market capitalization? Data is, of course, transferred across borders. And according to a study by McKinsey's, global cross-border data traffic was worth a whopping $2.8 trillion in 2014. Here in the UK, we apparently account for 11.5% of that cross-border data, according to another study by Frontier Economics. But I'm not here to quote statistics at you. My point is that data is economically important. Indeed, it is so important that if the data cannot flow, trade may not happen. This kind of economic impact has political consequences. It's the big numbers that get politicians interested. The growth in the importance of data in the economy has attracted the interests of governments, and as a consequence, they want to regulate it. Of course, when I talk about regulation of data, I am referring to data protection law. There is a new European data protection law, and you may well have heard about this. This is called the General Data Protection Regulation, also known as the GDPR. And it is a direct consequence of the importance of data as the new currency. The GDPR is not just about the volume of data. It is about the way that the data is processed. And this is the reason why the EU wanted to bring in a new law. If we think back, historically, to the first data protection laws, the UK had a data protection law in 1984. The EU brought in a directive in 1995. In those days, the processing of data was very, very simple. It was basically names, addresses, telephone numbers, and a few bits of customer data. I would suggest it was binary and two-dimensional. And indeed, any transfers of data between companies would have been a binary transfer. Now compare that with what we do today with the data. I really don't need to tell an audience like you, but I'll just list them to make the point. We have things like predictive analytics, machine-assisted learning, data profiling, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. Think about how, for example, a smartphone will collect data. It knows who you are, where you were, who you spoke to, what you said, and what you paid. And that data could be transferred to a cloud-based service provider who passes it on to a third party, and it's all in another jurisdiction. I would argue that the data flows today are no longer two-dimensional and binary. They are three-dimensional, dynamic, and real-time. And these are the characteristics that turn the raw data into a currency that can be traded. One thing that may seem a little strange to you is why a law that is regulating a currency that is traded is in fact a data protection law which is officially privacy law. And privacy is a fundamental right. This may seem like a rather strange paradox, but there is a reason for it. If you think about the data that is being collected and processed, it gives information about our most personal and most intimate lives. They do say that Facebook knows a woman is pregnant before her husband does. And that is exactly the point. That is why the European Union wanted to bring in a new data protection law. It was to address the automated processing of data on a vast scale of this very intimate information. The EU felt that those old laws, or its old directive in its case, from 1995, was no longer appropriate. So this new law was adopted in 2016, and it will take effect from May next year. At the heart of it are clauses on data profiling and the regulation of automated processing, and it carries with it massive fines for non-compliance. But in the context of the current UK political situation, and yes, I am about to mention the dreaded B word, and some of you, by the way you're laughing, may actually know what I'm about to say. But the GDPR has one very interesting provision, and that concerns the regulation of cross-border data flows and the transfer of data to what the EU calls third countries. Third countries are any countries that are not members of the European Union. That has very significant consequences for our current political situation. After Brexit Day, on the 31st of March 2019, the UK will become a third country. The UK will need to comply with the third country regulations if UK companies want to transfer data to and from the EU 27. Now I wonder, perhaps I can throw out a question to you. Is anyone here aware that data is being discussed in the Brexit talks? We have a couple of hands. So a couple of people do. So for the rest of you, both the European Union and the UK government recognise the economic importance of data. But I would just like to give you a little quick aside here while we're talking about Brexit, because I thought it was rather interesting to think about how when the UK joined what was then the European Community in 1972, a data protection law hadn't even been conceived of. And I think I am correct, I'm sure someone here will correct me if I'm wrong, that around 1972, we saw the first early email transmissions and the beginnings of internet technology were just being invented. So how different was that from the situation today? Leaving the single market means quitting a single regulatory regime that was designed to remove barriers across 28 countries. The big issue for Brexit and data, and the one that is going to affect all of you, is that the data flows between the UK and the European Union could stop. This is ultimately what our government and the European Union are worried about. Can I perhaps ask another question? Is anybody here aware that there are 2 position papers on data? One from the UK government and one from the European Union. Does anyone know about these position papers here? A couple of people do. Okay. Well, I read through them both in anticipation of coming here. These 2 position papers are poles apart. The British government says, and I'm going to have to read this because it's a little bit Sir Humphrey language. It is essential to avoid regulatory uncertainty that may force businesses to incur additional costs. That's what the British government says. The EU paper is, on the one hand, more opaque, but when you work through the legal coding of it, it's actually more direct. It says that the data flows between the UK and the EU 27 will terminate unless certain conditions are put in place. The key condition is what is called an adequacy decision. In very simple terms, an adequacy decision means that the European Commission has to determine that the UK is a safe place to transfer personal data. An adequacy decision would govern all data transfers between the EU and the UK from all companies. So that would mean you would all be okay to carry on doing what you're doing. But the problem is if there is no adequacy decision. If there is no adequacy decision, it is still possible to transfer data legally between the EU and the UK, but it will mean a lot of red tape. And that red tape, from the point of view of you and your businesses, means things like binding corporate rules and model contracts, and it will incur high legal fees. The other way you can do it is to set up a data center inside the EU 27 for the purposes of handling EU personal data. That, of course, will entail expenses which might be reconfiguring your systems. But what really bothers me about the Brexit situation relates to what I said earlier about the way that data processing has changed, and it not being binary and two-dimensional anymore, but rather being three-dimensional, dynamic, real-time, cloud-based, and multi-jurisdiction. The studies of the data economy, as we've already mentioned with those statistics, show that cross-border data transfers are an important element of the global economy. I would suggest that pulling out of a regime governing 28 countries doesn't really make sense in the modern data economy. However, we are where we are. And I'm just going to finish by leaving you with the thought that it may be in the interests of all of us to watch how the political talks over Brexit could impact on the value of that very currency that underpins most of your businesses. Thank you very much.